Welcome back, everyone. Today, question is, was Jesus always perfect or did he become perfect? You might think you have an answer for it, but then we open to the book of Hebrews chapter 2 and we see where he became perfect. Let me just show you quick before we jump into this. We're looking in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 9, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. So Jesus is a captain of our salvation. He's the one who provided it. And it says he was made perfect through suffering. What does that mean? Jesus wasn't perfect? Because if something is not perfect, it becomes perfect. That means that at one point it wasn't, right? I mean, you can't become perfect if you already are perfect. So does that mean Jesus wasn't perfect? What is the answer to this question? The answer is actually very simple, and I'll just give it to you, and we'll talk about this passage a little bit more. Jesus became perfect in the sense it became completed in understanding something that he would not have understood had he never been through the incarnation, had he never actually become man. The word perfect has the idea of being complete. It's not like there was sin and there was a problem in him and he became better, but there was something that God cannot experience in himself. There are many things that he can't experience being God. He can't experience what it's like to be a man unless the incarnation happens. He becomes a man. He can't understand what it's like to obey in the sense that humans do, what it's like to suffer in death, what it's like to experience temptation. These are things that God doesn't that God can't experience because he is God. Well, in the incarnation, Jesus was able to experience these things with us and therefore identify with us in our sin, which is the reason that he could even die for our sins, but also we can then come to him and he knows what it's like for us. So you may have seen the commercials that have been showing in the last couple of years, the He Gets Us campaign, right? And usually the idea behind the He Gets Us campaign, it seems very woke, kind of very liberal, where, Jesus is kneeling at the feet of an LGBTQ person or something like that. Obviously, the message there isn't right. But when we say Jesus gets us, he actually does, not in the sense where I'm condoning your sin, because that seems to be what those commercials are really getting at. But he gets us in the fact that he was like us, not with our sin, but he experienced the ramifications of our sin that we experienced. He lived on this earth. He got dusty feet. He stubbed his toe, probably got splinters, maybe hit his hand with a hammer. He experienced all these things like we experience. Of course, he did it all without sin. And as he did that, he was able to become perfect through suffering. Let's go back to Hebrews here, verse 9. We see Jesus, he was made a little lower than the angels. We are less than the angels as far as our abilities and things go. Jesus didn't just come to the angels. He came all the way down to a man, to be a man that lived in this world with sinful men all around. Why? That he, by the grace of God, might taste death for everyone. That's why Jesus came, because he could die. Now, he could not become an angel and die for a man. It was a man's debt that was owed to God. Therefore, Jesus had to become a man in order to pay it. This is something we don't understand because we understand advancement, right? We want to become better. We want a promotion in our job. We want to be elevated. And Jesus even had to tell the parable about, or the example anyway, about don't take the highest seat, take the lowest seat, and then you can work your way up. We always want the best, right? Well, Jesus didn't go up, he went down. He took on himself the form of a man. He became a man while continuing to be God, and that is the way he could die for us, but he could also identify with us in our sin. I want you to look at verse 11 here. I'm sorry, moving this around out. Verse 11, for both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. That's the way that Jesus could call us brothers, because he actually became one of us. He actually became a man. The verses 12 and 13 are just quoting some places in the Old Testament talking about how Jesus identifies with our sin. But I want to go down and look at verse 14 right here. It says, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. So we have partaken of flesh and blood. We are here on this earth. We are people. And Jesus did the same thing for us. And he can identify with us in verse 15 and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So Jesus when he became a man, he was able to experience things and be completed in that way, experiencing things that he could not have experienced had he never actually become man. Verse 16, for indeed, he does not give aid to angels, but he does give aid to the seed of Abraham. He didn't come to save angels. He came to save man. And as a man, he experienced the things that men experience. Verse 17, therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. The only way that he could actually make propitiation or make the atonement for people is to be a man. The high priest in the Old Testament had to be a man, and he would offer sacrifices for himself and then for the people. Well, Jesus came and he didn't have to offer sacrifice for himself. He could offer sacrifice for the people. He had to become a man in order to be the high priest. And as a man, he was able to experience suffering. He was able to experience temptation. He was able to experience death. All these things that he would never have been able to experience had he never become a man. I just want to look at verse 18 to finish up with this. For in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. So not only did Jesus become a man so he could die for our sins, but one of the results of that is that he knows what it's like. We had that song we used to sing all the time when I was a kid, tell it to Jesus, tell it to Jesus. You know, you can bring your burdens to him and he knows. How is it we can tell it to Jesus? Because he knows what it's like to live here. He knows what it's like because we can come to him and we can say, look, I've got this problem. And he says, I know what it's been like. If you lost your job, you come to him and you say, you know, I lost my job. I don't know how to pay my bills. It's almost like he could say, you know what? I know what that's like because I didn't have a place to lay my head. I didn't have a nice house. You could come to him and say, I've been diagnosed with a terminal disease and I'm not going to live long. And he could say, look, I died when I was 33. Tragic, terrible death. And I knew it was coming and I experienced the dreads. I know what it's like to know that you're going to die soon. You could come to God and Jesus and say, look, my relationship, my marriage or whatever has fallen apart. And he says, I know what it's like. I experienced a friction in my eternal relationship with the Father when I took the sin on me on the cross. You could say, well, Jesus, you don't understand marriage. I mean, you were never married. But he says, look, my bride is the church. And look what the church has done to me, right? You say, well, come on, my problems are with children, right? You don't know, Jesus, what it's like to have wayward children. And he say, what about that time I stood over Jerusalem and I said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. He knows what it's like to have children who don't want to pay attention to him. Sometimes you might say, well, Jesus, I just want to quit. You don't know what it's like to quit. I just want to quit. And he might say, you know what? Think about that night before I died. I went up to the garden with my disciples and they fell asleep. They weren't passionate enough about what was going on. And I prayed, if there's any other way for this to happen, let that happen. You think I didn't feel like quitting in my flesh? See, he knows what it's like to experience. He knows what it's like to have his friends turned against him. He knows what all this is like. So you can tell it to Jesus, right? You can bring it to him. He knows. So did Jesus become perfect? No, he didn't become perfect as without sin, but he was able to experience some things that he would never have been able to experience had he not become a man. And that gave him the complete experience of being a man where he could die for us. He could also understand what we're going through in this life. Hope that helps you. God bless.